by in ancient Mesopotamia and Greece. Stories told of blood-drinking spirits and ghouls like the Greek Lamia, Empusa, and Striges, who preyed on the living at night. These were not vampires as we know them, but they laid the foundation for those chilling legends across India. Undead spirits, such as Vetalas and Pishachars, haunted graveyards, inhabiting corpses and draining their energy, foreshadowing the archetype of supernatural revenants that would evolve into vampires in later cultures. In medieval Europe, blood-drinking demons and devilish revenants blurred the lines between folklore and fear. Across ancient Egypt to Arabia, ghouls haunted the imagination, instilling dread in communities that had no concept of microscopic pathogens. With the rise of Slavic folklore, especially in Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, Poland, and Greece, more defined vampire myths took shape. These undead revenants drank blood or life essence, emerging from graves to terrorize the living. In 1672, near Tinjan, modern Croatia, the case of Joao Grando was recorded. Villagers believed his corpse stalked them. He was staked and beheaded, the first historical figure labeled a vampire during the early 1700s. Mass grave exhumations and staking became widespread in Eastern Europe. To notorious Kazispetar Blagojevic de 1725 and Arnold Pale d. 1731 were documented by Austrian officials and circulated in Western Europe, triggering a wave of vampire hysteria. In rural Poland, burials featuring sickles, padlocks, stones, bore stakes designed to prevent the dead from rising became common. Archaeologists recently confirmed these were intended to thwart undead individuals in 17th century graves. Meanwhile, in New England, during the late 19th century, tuberculosis outbreaks sparked local vampire panics. The infamous Mercy Brown case of 1892 involved exhuming her corpse, burning her heart, and creating a folk cure for the living, a dramatic echo of centuries-old European practices. Medical misunderstandings played a key role. Diseases like plague, rabies, and consumption terabite presented symptoms like bleeding mouths or violent convulsions that people interpreted as signs of vampirism in a time before germ theory. Finally, in 18th century Enlightenment Europe, authorities such as Empress Maria Theresa and her physician Gerhard van Swieten intervened, banning grave desecrations and staking rituals. Yet these long-standing beliefs endured, immortalized in folklore and later reimagined in literature. As the 18th century dawned, Europe entered the infamous vampire craze. Reports flooded from Eastern Europe, first in Serbia and Hungary, then across the Habsburg realms of exhumations, revealing seemingly alive, bloated corpses with blood at the mouth. To high-profile cases, Petar Blagojevic and Arnold Pale were examined by authorities, sparking panic, mass grave raids, and staking rituals. In these first recorded official vampire panics, military and civil reports used terms like Krum Serbian to label these undead, later stabilized into the modern word vampire, borrowed by German, French, and English languages. Folk attributes of these early vampires varied, imagined as bloated and ruddy rather than pale. They were often seen in their burial shrouds with expelled blood chewing on the fabric. Apotropaic countermeasures included garlic, holy symbols, mustard seeds, and grave-bound stakes or stones. In Poland, archaeological discoveries like burials with sickles placed over necks or padlocked Toscan fur. 17th century fear of revenants. These strikes were not fictional. Polish Opia stories depict revenants attacking loved ones, prompting community-led burials to restrain them. Explaining the myth, decomposition naturally bloats corpses, pushes blood from orifices, can release gas that sounds like groaning, all ripe for misinterpretation by pre-scientific peoples. Hair and nails, shrinking post-mortem, added to the illusion of growth. Contributing to vampire rumors, non-European parallels include a global tapestry of blood-drinking demons. From ancient Greek Striges and Roman Empusi to Indian Vetulas and Chinese Jiangxis. While distinct, they share key themes, like nocturnal feeding on the living dot by the early 19th century. Gothic literature co-opted and romanticized vampires. John Polidori's 1819, The Vampire, introduced the charismatic, aristocratic vampire lord Rothven Payau, seductive and socially elevated, stark contrast to the bloated folkloric revenant. The genre evolved through penny dreadfuls like Varney the Vampire, 1847, and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, 1871, which added lesbian subtexts and the trope of the stake through the heart, enriching the vampire's psychology and societal role. Dracula 1897 by Bram Stoker sealed the modern mythos. Count Dracula was suave yet sinister, able to transform, repelled by garlic and sunlight, and emblematic of invading foreign threats. P's epistolary structure blended folklore with cutting-edge Victorian technology and anxieties. 20th, 21st century transformations. Vampire portrayals diversified from Nosferatu's expressionist monstrosity to Anne Rice's introspective, tormented creatures and Twilight's romantic teen icons. Modern works continue to reinvent the vampire, reflecting cultural shifts and new fears, yet all trace their roots back to that smoky, mysterious past. In ancient Sumer-Sea, 3200 BC, texts mention Lilith and similar demonic figures, harlots and child-snatching demons, who fed on human life force or blood, marking one of the earliest echoes of vampire archetypes. By Babylonian times, 2000 to 1600 BC, Lilith evolved in myth as a childbearing demon known for stealing babies and blood, embedding the idea of a female blood drinker into early mythos. Greek and Roman traditions featured the Striges and Empusan nocturnal, blood-drinking creatures that preyed on infants and travelers. They served as pillars for the later Eastern European vampire imagery, in medieval Greece. The Vrykolokozan, undead that fed on flesh or bloody, merged distinctly in folklore. Corpses found bloated, undecayed, or with chains and scythes placed on them to prevent rising, were often labeled as such. The first well-documented English-language use of vampire appeared in 1734, derived from the Slavic opir, marking vampire's introduction into mainstream Western lexicons. The notorious blood countess Elizabeth Bathory, 1560 a 1614, though not supernatural, was rumor-made immortal through legends describing her bathing in virgins. Blood to preserve youth-feeding vampire lore cycles. Peasant cases like Petar Blagojevic d. 1725 involved exhumation reports of undecomposed corpses blamed for killing neighbors. Austrian authorities documented these, naming them vampiri, confirming how seriously this was taken. Archaeologists recently uncovered 17th century graves in Poland, where sickles, padlocks, stones, and burying corpses face down suggest preventive anti-vampire measures confirming real historical fear of undead rising. Highgate Cemetery in London became a 1970s focal point of vampire hysteria. Reporters and occultists fueled rumors of sightings. Two self-titled vampire hunters even dueled over credibility, bringing vampirism into modern urban legend. New Orleans birthed its own vampire legend. Jacques Saint-Germain reportedly throwing lavish dinners where he never ate, allegedly biting guests before vanishing into rumors and lore. Blending folklore and local myth in the 20th century, long before Europe spun its legends. Mesopotamian cultures, Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians described Lilith and other night demons that preyed on infants and mothers. These figures drank blood and were sometimes called blood-sucking or vampiric spirits, marking some of the earliest recorded vampire-like beings. Sumerian lore, c. 2000 BC, Lilitu, were wind spirits and seductresses drinking blood. In Jewish mythology, Lilith emerged as Adam's first wife turned demon, feared for her attacks on children and men at night. These Mesopotamian tales seeped into Hebrew and later traditions, as incantation bowls and Hellenistic magic texts warned against Lilith and her kind, underscoring a long-standing belief in female night spirits, feeding on human vitality. Turning to Europe, Greek and Roman myths featured predators like Striges, Impusus, Lamea, and Mormonite time blood drinkers and child stealers. Impusa were seductive demons of Hecate who drained men in their sleep. Striges were bird-like, feasting on flesh, bile, and blood in medieval Greece. The Vrykolokas roamed graveyards as undead revenants, sometimes bloated, sometimes decayed, blamed for disease and death. Communities often tied chains, placed sickles, or staked corpses to haunt these revenants. Etymology matters. The word vampire entered English in the 1730s, via German Vampir, itself drawn from Serbian vampir, and earlier Slavic terms like upir or upir. These reports followed Austrian inquiries into exhumations marked by apparent lifelike decomposition. Jumping forward to Victorian England, Highgate Cemetery in North London erupted in supernatural frenzy during the 1970s. reports of grey figures, a ghostly cyclist, and drained foxes fueled media frenzies. Two self-proclaimed vampire hunters, Sean Manchester and David Farrant, led competing mobs wielding stakes, crucifixes, and ritual incantations in full nighttime raids. The climax came on Friday the 13th of March, 1970, when nearly 100 amateur hunters stormed the sealed cemetery gates. Some exhumed and mutilated corpses, drove stakes into coffins, even left decapitated bodies in public places, claiming authority over the undeed. Authorities eventually intervened. Farrant was arrested in August 1970 for interfering with graves, while Manchester's rival claims sparked a media rivalry and a televised magician's duel that never happened. By January 7, 1732, Fluckinger's team formally opened graves under military escort. They found corpses with fresh red blood in orifices and plump bodies. Areopagitically, they declared them in vampiric condition, then conducted beheadings, purged and burned the remains, reinterring those already decomposed. A final document, Fluckinger's Visum et Repertum, dated January 26, 1732, was submitted to authorities in Belgrade and became widely distributed. On February 13th, Glazer's father forwarded descriptions to a Nuremberg journal, dramatically spreading the story across Europe and intensifying vampire panic. This Serbian outbreak, alongside Petar Blagojevic's earlier case in 1725, ignited the Enlightenment era vampire controversy, a public debate blending superstition, medicine, and science over naturally explained decomposition versus supernatural UNDEAD. Meanwhile, Dampier's offspring of vampires and humans are in Balkan folklore, believed to inherit neither vampiric weaknesses nor immortality. Male Dampiers were thought to detect vampires and wield sorcery, often functioning as hereditary vampire hunters. Signs of their heritage included dark hair, rapid physical growth, or, in some legends, a tail mark, although rarely discussed in Western literature until recent centuries. Dampier folk beliefs persisted locally. They were considered mostly human, but with uncanny abilities to locate and destroy vampires, suggesting a mythic buffer between ordinary humans and undead threats. In January 1732, a military commission led by Johann Fluckinger exhumed 13 recently deceased villagers in Serbia. Reports noted that many corpses appeared in vampiric condition, plump, reddish in color, with fluid blood at orifices and new hair and nail growth. Those still decayed others were decapitated, burned, and their ashes thrown into the West Morava River, echoing widespread anti-vampire ritual practice. Fluckinger's Visum et Repertum, seen and discovered, finalized January 26, 1732, was submitted to Vienna, then published in Nuremberg later that year. Its sensational accounts, endorsed by multiple military and medical officials, ignited widespread enlightenment and church-led debates across Europe on the reality of vampires versus natural decomposition. The reports prompted controversy among scholars and clergy. Some embraced rational decomposition explanations, while others, like Dom Gustian Calmerton, investigated extensively before concluding no biblical basis for the undead existed, helping quell panic by the mid-1700s. Alongside the Serbian cases, the Dampier emerged in South Slavic folklore, half human, half vampire, being often born to a human mother and a male vampire, believed to possess nothing of the vampire's weaknesses, but many of its strengths. Dampiers were considered natural vampire slayers, capable of sensing the undeadavan, when Invisibiland often led lineages of vampire hunters in Balkan villages. Folkloric descriptions vary. Albanian stories attribute untamed dark hair, a lack of shadow and charisma. Bulgarian tales describe being very dirty, soft-bodied, nail-less, or even tail-marked. They could walk in daylight, eat normally, and detect or destroy vampires, embodying a living bridge between human and undead realms. Dampiers, the offspring of a vampire and a human typically, from male vampire and human female unions are a staple of South Slavic folklore. The name Dampier stems from Albanian roots, domtooth plus pier, to drink, itself derived from Slavic. They were believed to possess traits both human eating normally, mortal lifespan, and vampiric unnatural strength, magical sensitivity. Folklore attributes specific abilities and signs to Dampiers. Male Dampiers were thought to see and hunt vampires. Some said they could see invisible undead and wield sorcery across generations. Physical markers varied by regional Albanian tales mention untamed dark hair and courage. Bulgarian lore notes a tail mark, soft or jelly-like bodies, absence of nails, dirty appearance, or pronounced features. Monstropedia confirms Dampier were paid handsomely meat, cattle, or clothing for their services as vampire hunters as late as the 1950s. Medieval archaeology continues to unveil grim proof of vampire fears. In September 2024, archaeologists excavating Gora Chelmska in Chelm, Poland, unearthed two 13th century child burials, showing classic anti-vampire treatment. One skeleton even appeared decapitated. Its body buried faced medieval European fears of revenant children terrorizing the living. A chilling 2022 discovery at P, Poland, dubbed the Field of Vampires, revealed an elite 18-year-old woman, nicknamed Zosia Sealed, with a sickle across her neck and a padlock on her toe. Experts believe these methods aimed to decapitate and immobilize her should she rise from the grave. Skull analysis indicates she had a protruding tooth and potential deformities that marked her as other, and she wore a silk headdress denoting high status even, so superstition overrode standing. Her face has since been reconstructed, using 3D techniques to restore her dignity beyond historical reactions. Modern times have also seen transformations of vampire identity into spiritual subcultures. Contemporary real vampires partake in donor-fed blood consumption, psychic vampirism, and identity-based rituals. In Australia, vampire courts have emerged, hosting events like Melbourne's Carpe Noctem Ball. Some groups, led by figures like Andreas Bathory, describe vampirism as a hyper-real religion that offers belonging and empowerment. Academics are paying attention to. Surveys conducted by researchers like Emia Williams in Wales aim to chart the UK's self-identified vampire subculture, estimated at 15,000 adults, exploring their behaviors, beliefs, and spiritual identities. Some spiritual organizations formalize this identity. The Temple of the Vampire, founded in the US in 1989, presents vampirism as a structured esoteric faith. It maintains rituals, hierarchy, and a guiding text. The Vampire Bibleland asserts vampirism as a path to empowerment, not fictional fantasy. By the mid-1970s, the legend had achieved folkloric status. Bill Ellis's 1993 scholarly analysis described the Highgate vampire as a modern legend shaped by rumor, competition, and sensational media living myth in an overgrown Victorian plea cemetery. In late 1969, local occult enthusiasts began gathering at Highgate Cemetery in North London. On the night of December 24th, 1969, David Farrant claimed to have seen a grey figure moving among the tombs, prompting him to write to the Hampstead and Highgate Express on February 6, 1970, asking if others had witnessed strange sightings. In response, readers reported diverse spectres: a tall man in a hat, a floating cyclist, a woman in white, a pale figure gliding on the grass, even phantasmal bells and voices emanating from Swains Lane adjacent to the cemetery. On February 27, 1970, Bitchon Manchester, a self-styled bishop of the Old Catholic Church, declared to the press his conviction. The sightings were not ghosts, but a king vampire, a medieval Wallachian nobleman resurrected via modern Satanists. The story captured national attention. On Friday, March 13, 1970, Manchester announced a planned exorcism via ITV broadcasts. That evening, nearly 100 self-proclaimed vampire hunters scaled the gates and walls, breaking into Highgate Cemetery with stakes, crucifixes, garlic, and at least one gravedigger's shovel in hand. During the ensuing chaos, some corpses were allegedly disturbed, coffins pried open, stakes driven through lids, and, in one grisly case, a headless, charred female body was found near a catacomb on August 1st, 1970, prompting a police probe into suspected black magic rituals. In August 1970, Farrant was arrested at Highgate, carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. Although eventually released, his involvement in grave desecration fueled the controversy. Meanwhile, Manchester claimed to have forced open a family vault, burning incense, scattering garlic, and nearly staking a corpse that evidence, however, stems solely from his own writings. Rumors of a public magician's duel between Farrant and Manchester on Friday, April 13th, 1973, circulated widely but ultimately came to nothing. In 1974, Farrant was convicted of vandalism and burial site interference. He maintained the acts were necessary to thwart Satanists, not vampires. Folklorist Bill Ellis, in a 1993 issue of Folklore, concluded the Highgate story epitomizes modern legend-making rumor, sensational press, moral panic, rivalry, and urban mythol layered atop a Victorian, overgrown cemetery. As 20th century cinema emerged, the vampire made its transition from page to screen. Silent era examples like The Vampire 1913, inspired by Kipling's poem, and A Night of Horror 1916 marked the first feature-length films featuring vampire-like creatures. In 1922, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu brought the grotesque, rat-faced Count Orlok to life, an unauthorized Dracula adaptation that not only shaped cinematic horror with its use of shadow and plague imagery, but also introduced the lethal sunlight, TROPE. Classic Hollywood followed with Dracula 1931, starring Bela Lugosi defining the suave, aristocratic vampire, and spawned a wave of Universal sequels, including Dracula's Daughter and Son of Dracula, cementing the vampire as a screen icon. The 1930s also saw Carl Dreyer's Vampire 1932, a dreamy, atmospheric horror infused with surrealistic visuals and directly inspired by Le Fanu's Carmilla and The Room in the Dragon Volant. Mid-century European cinema introduced eroticism and camp to vampire lore. Hammer Films revitalized Dracula via Christopher Lee in 1958, while 1960s and 70s productions, Blood and Roses 1960, The Vampire Lovers 1970, explored lesbian vampire themes rooted in Carmilla. Literary tropes also evolved. James Reimer, Varney the Vampire 1847, established many modern conventions. Hypnotism, twilight sympathy affecting. Later works like Dracula. In the mid-20th century, vampire fiction diversified. Richard Matheson's I Am Legend 1953 and Stephen King's Salem's Lot 1975 gave vampirism a scientific twist with viruses and contagion. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire 1976 ushered in the tragic vampire archetype, immortal, tortured by guilt-marking, a shift from monster to emotionally complex anti-hero. The goth subculture, originating in 1970s England, embraced vampires as symbols of entrenched otherness, melancholic beauty, and subversive identity, reinforcing the modern image of vampires as dark romantics. Entering the 21st century, vampire pop culture morphed again, from the romantic passion of Twilight to indie cinema, Only Lovers Left Alive, What We Do in the Shadows, and philosophical horror, Robert Eggers's current Nosferatu remake, rooted in folklore terror. Folklore attributes a host of origins to vampires, according to early Slavic and Chinese tales. If an animalist, a dog or cat, jumped over a corpse, that body was feared to rise as a vampire. Untreated wounds and individuals who rejected the church were also thought likely to become vampires after death. In Balkan mythology, hybrid beings like the Dhampir, the offspring of a vampire and human, often through a car console or loop, believed to detect and destroy vampires. Preventative burial rituals abounded. Corpses were buried upside with sickles, scythes, padlocks, stones, or nails inserted to hinder possible revenants, reflecting deep communal fear. The vampire craze of the 1720s-1730s began when Austrian officials recorded exhumations of Petar Blagojevich D. 1725, and Arnold Pale. These corpses, found seemingly undercomposed and stained with blood, were staked and burned accounts that ignited Western European panic. The case of Petar Blagojevich became iconic. Villagers described new hair, nails, fresh blood jets, and a bloated, ruddy corpse. His body was staked, decapitated, then incinerated. Rituals documented by Austrian officials. English language vampire fiction took root when Polydorus, the vampire, 1819, introduced a charismatic, aristocratic vampire, Lord Ruthven I, to present vampirism as an alluring, supernatural aristocracy. Setting a literary standard, the serialized Varney, the Vampire, 1845-47, introduced many enduring tropes: fangs, neck bites, hypnotism, daytime disguise, creating the sympathetic vampire archetype. Bram Stoker's Dracula 1897 drew upon Transylvanian history, possibly inspired by Vlad the Impaler, integrating folklore, garlic, stakes, daylight weakness into a structured narrative of invasion and moral anxiety. As technology advanced, vampires permeated film. Murnau's Nosferatu, 1922, adapted Dracula into Count Orlokrat-faced, plague omnipresent, sunlight vulnerable, cementing the vampire in cinematic horror. The Highgate Vampire of 1970s. London brought vampiric legends into modern urban myth, media sensationalism, and public hysteria, rooted in Victorian cemetery decay. Pitted David Farrant and Sean Manchester in bitter media battles over who would vanquish the vampire. Farrant's arrest and Manchester's writings in the 70s and 80s documented this living legend in South Slavic folklore. The Dampier child born of a vampire and a humani merged as a unique figure, usually male. Dampiers were believed to inherit vampires' slaying abilities. They could see the undead and often became hunters of their own kind. Folklore describes them as energetic, cunning, perhaps bearing subtle physical oddities, for example, distinctive hair, enlarged features, or even tails, depending on the regional Albanian, Serbian, Bulgarian, highlighting a living bridge between worlds. The Arnold Pale case, c. 1725-1732, reinforced vampire hysteria in Habsburg-held Serbia, reported by Austrian military physicians Glaser and Flockinger. Villagers exhumed his body and victims it allegedly killed, discovering undercomposed flesh, new hair, nails, and fluid blood at the orifices. They subsequently staked, beheaded, burned the corpses, rituals sanctioned by officials. The detailed reports circulated through Vienna and Europe, fueling Enlightenment-era debates on vampirism and corpse decomposition. The etiology of vampire legends lies deeply rooted in misunderstood decomposition. In Eastern Europe's 18th century vampire controversy, villagers and officials documented corpses that appeared unexpectedly fresh bloated bodies, red skin, oozing blood from orifices or common post-mortem phenomena, misinterpreted as the signs of VAMPIRSM. The case of Arnold Pale, a Serbian Hajduk who died around 1725, was pivotal. Austrian military physicians Glaser and Fluckinger corroborated local accounts. Powell's exhumed body, along with those of about 16 victims, showed fluid blood, fresh nails and hair growth, and plump flesh leading villagers to stake, behead, burn, and scatter the ashes of the corpses to halt the supposed epidemic. Their official report, later published in Vienna, greatly fueled Western Europe's vampire panic. The case of Arnold Payhol was meticulously documented in 1732 by Austrian military surgeons first, Johann Glaser, then Johann Fluckinger. Their report described exhuming approximately 40 bodies. About 17 displayed signs associated with vampirism: plump flesh, blood at the mouth, new hair and nails, and even audible groaning when staked. Subsequent decapitation, burning, and ash scattering into the West Morava River were performed under military and local supervision to halt the alleged outbreak. Glazer's December 1731 report noted 13 unexplained deaths in 6 weeks, characterized by chest pain, fevers, and limb convulsions, likely linked to famine or disease. Villagers insisted on exhumation to reveal vampires, and Glaser recommended executing the corpses for public peace. Academic recognition of vampire lore has surged in recent years. Scholarship now spans across literature, folklore, sociology, anthropology, and media studies. For instance, Lauren Seaberg's 2025 Mega Amperes thesis from Chapman University examines the transition from Victorian-era vampires like Dracula and Carmilla to modern representations that challenge identity and societal norms. Meanwhile, universities such as UVA and Wisconsin-Madison offer formal courses exploring vampires in folklore, literature, video games, and cultural myth. For example, SLAV 2500, Exploring Vampires in Video Games at UVA Vampire Folklore at UW-Madison. Meanwhile, universities such as UVA and Wisconsin-Madison offer formal courses exploring vampires in folklore, literature, video games, and cultural myth. For example, SLAV 2500, Exploring Vampires in Video Games at UVA, Vampire Folklore at UW-Madison. Vampire studies has emerged as a thriving interdisciplinary field. Platforms like academia.edu hosts thousands of papers focusing on cultural studies, gender, race, desire, and the figure of the vampire in modern media. One 2025 article explores how Anne Rice's interview with the vampire shifted the vampire from terrifying other to introspective anti-hero. Intertwining dialogues of social mobility, compassion, and embodied otherness. Sociologists and ethnographies are charting real-world vampire subcultures. A 2025 investigation highlights self-identified real vampires in Australia and beyond vampire courts that gather, engage in consensual blood donation, spiritual rituals, and community events like the Carpe Noctem Ball, led by figures such as Andreas Bathory. They represent what scholars term hyper-real religions, living spiritual movements rooted in identity and belonging rather than fantasy. In recent years, self-identified real vampires have formed secretive communities worldwide. By 2025 investigation into Australia's underground vampire courts reveals groups where members drink human blood with donor consent and medical precaution, wear fang prosthetics, and host elaborate vampire balls like Melbourne's Carpe Noctem, be emerging form of identity and ritual, rather than mere subcultural fashion. Not all experiences are benign. One Australian woman, Crystal, recounts being allegedly drugged, coerced into drinking blood mixed with cordial, and even experiencing non-consensual feeding, highlighting ethical concerns about boundary violations. Even within consenting frameworks, medical and psychological dimensions are noted. Prominent figures like Don Jason with Porphyria assert that blood feeding restores physical health. Some report sensations of lethargy or psychosomatic symptoms relieved only through feeding, while critics suggest mental health motives. Medical professionals emphasize harm reduction via donor health screenings. Scholars label these communities as hyper-real religions. University researchers, including Dr. Adam Possami of Western Sydney, an architect of the vampire court concept, describe them as belief systems, merging spiritual practice, identity, and subcultural aesthetic suffering, belonging in a secular age. Academic interest continues to grow, formalizing vampire studies. At UW-Madison, courses like Folklore 327, Littrans 327, Vampires Explore Folklore, Literature, Film, and Sociocultural Issues, Race, Sexuality, Class through Vampire Narratives. UW's summer course, The Vampire in Literature and Film, is a popular interdisciplinary elective analyzing the vampire's role in culture. From Nosferatu to Buffy. Internationally, MA programs like the University of Hertfordshire's Reading the Vampire emphasize sexuality and alterity in vampire lore. Institutional, spiritual movements have formed around vampirism. The Temple of the Vampire, founded in 1989 U.S., frames vampirism as an esoteric transhumanist path. Its scripture, the Vampire Bible, outlines rituals to build magical prowess and vitality, positioned as a structured spiritual tradition rather than fantasy play. The story ends, and if you are still here and fully awake, then you are very patient or very interested in the story. If that's the case, please leave a like and subscribe so you can hear more from me, and because they will fire me if you don't. Now, I will leave the rest of you who have fallen asleep to rest with this fire effect. Enjoy and have a nice dream.